Well, thank you for joining me today, Karen, Jay, appreciate it. So, I wanted to kick off the conversation talking about something that's high on everyone's mind. We've seen a lot of turmoil in the crypto markets over the last couple weeks, crypto firms filing for bankruptcy, the collapse of a popular algorithmic stablecoin. And so I want to ask you about how regulation fits into all of this. Do you think there is anything that regulators could have done or should have done to prevent some of these failures?
Sure. Thanks so much, and thank you all for having us. Really appreciate it, the opportunity to speak about regulation in crypto. I think the lesson that's learned from this is that if we could create a regulatory framework that actually provides some consistency, whether it's disclosures, whether it's understanding what kind of assets or businesses are being looked at and being built, that it would give not only customers, but give other businesses, other investors more certainty on what's happening. And I think that transparency is really important. And so what we are very hopeful and optimistic about is that we will see a regulatory framework come together. And I think Senator Lummis and Gillibrand are doing a lot of work to do that at the legislative level, but what we're really hopeful is that the regulators will also come to the table in a transparent way to actually create some of those consistent measures across the board for really the life cycle of digital assets.
So, okay, let's just back up a little bit. What we saw in the past couple of months is really not something new. It may be new to the digital asset space, but the phenomenon of lots of leverage, a price correction, and a washout of people who are over-levered or don't have sufficient capital or liquidity is not new. So we're seeing that, and those things are important. We know that in any kind of financial asset, capital, liquidity, leverage control, these are age-old lessons. So we got that. One of the things that I think is important about regulation of digital assets is to look at the etymology, the genesis of digital assets. They came about in a different way from most financial innovations. Most financial innovations are domestic and institutional. Digital assets are global and largely retail. That has presented a regulatory challenge that we really haven't encountered before, which is trying to have global coordination across a new type of asset class at the retail level. So I think if you think about it that way, you understand why there's some challenges.
Well, and I guess what makes this moment maybe different than what we've seen in the past, even with just the crypto market. We've seen crashes before. We've seen bankruptcies before with Mt. Gox. So I'm curious how this is different, and if you think there is more will this time around to actually get something done.
Go ahead. Look, let me follow up on that with your very good question, which is, while let's just use the analogy of securities, or we can use banking, whichever you want. While securities look to trade the same globally, a stock here versus a stock in Hong Kong versus a stock in Shanghai, they actually are regulated differently. And that is one of the challenges that comes with digital assets, because it is a very global market with what I would say is quite different legacy regulatory approaches. I used to always say to people about investing in equities in the US, you have a pretty good set of rights. Somebody defrauds you, got a chance to get it back. There's generally a receivership bankruptcy code that's well understood. Most other places in the world, investing in equities, your chances of getting anything back in the event of bad behavior, substantially lower. And that's part of what we're seeing evolve in the crypto space.
To pull on the thread a little bit about the kind of the international scope, I think there are a lot of countries that are actually looking at this, and I think where it's different is we're at the ground level of some of the policy making, right? It is novel, it is new, the technology is eliminating intermediaries, it's changing market expectations, consumer expectations. So governments across the world are all looking at how to actually address these issues. In the United States, we're still the best place to do business, and so I think what we're trying to figure out here in the United States is how do you create a system system that can understand the technology, so get a base level line of understanding of the technology, and then how can you create a system that affords really the benefits of blockchain technology and crypto, and it doesn't kind of limit that in its infancy, but can really afford the benefits, 24/7 settling, the ability to interact at a retail level and not have to go through intermediaries, the ability to make sure that there's an immutable record. All of these benefits, we have to figure out a way to regulate it in a way that affords those benefits while still protecting the legacy consumer protections that we've done for years through the regulators in the United States.
So I completely agree. And your interview a moment ago, I think the bill that was dropped is an extremely responsible effort by both senators, because they're focusing on some of these key issues like custody, resolution, those things that are fundamental to the regulation of any market. They're saying, look, let's have a coordinated approach to those. So I want to say I applaud them for their effort, and particularly looking for feedback on what they're doing.
Well, and speaking of custody, so we have seen some regulation on this front too, not just maybe the legislation that's been proposed. The SEC, your former boss, actually put out a staff accounting bulletin 121.
My former boss?
Your former employer, I guess. Sorry, former employer.
Quote of the event.
I guess now.
And so, there's been a lot of chatter about that. In particular, it would require public companies to treat crypto that they are holding on behalf of clients as liabilities on their balance sheet. And so I wanted to get, I know Coinbase has weighed in a little bit on this in the past, so I wanted to get both of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the staff accounting bulletin, I think, that came out in a process that certainly impacted Coinbase as a public company, impacted a lot of different public companies, a lot of financial institutions. I think what we would most like to see come out of this situation is actually a public process that's transparent, that allows stakeholders to weigh in on how something like the staff accounting bulletin might impact consumers, businesses, other stakeholders. I think that's really the missing piece here as we think about what the next step is in the regulatory environment, is making sure that we have a regulatory process, a proper rulemaking process that can actually set out some of these concerns, and then what are the risks, and then what are the solutions to those risks.
Yeah, so I think somebody in the audience will tell me if I'm wrong. I think what you can look at the staff accounting bulletin is doing is taking an extremely conservative position with respect to the custody of crypto digital assets, and in terms of accounting, which is different from whatever the rules around effective custody are going to be. And like I said, I think that the bill does a very good job of saying, look, we should try and move toward a technology agnostic definition of appropriate custody across our securities laws, so that whatever the instrument is, if it's in tokenized form, there is a way to custody it that is akin to, and at least as good as, the traditional method for custodying securities. I think that's what's on the table, and if that is resolved, the question is, will the accounting advice from the staff change? That's sort of where I see things playing out at the moment.
Well, I want to switch gears a little bit here. I know, so Kara, you had mentioned what's happening on kind of the global front. We did see the EU agree to MiCA, the Markets and Crypto Assets Framework. And we have seen the Financial Stability Board say that they want to put out a proposal for sort of robust crypto regulation in October. I'm curious, do these efforts suggest that the U.S. is falling behind when it comes to regulating digital assets?
I think the short answer is yes. We are certainly, as we look at the opportunities that are being afforded in other countries, whether it's just the market opportunities, but also regulators who are really coming to the table to understand again what the technology is and what it can do, and how we need to have new thinking and a new framework and a new way to address some of these capabilities and these benefits. I think we are falling behind, and I think what the President's executive order actually talks about that, and the Department of Commerce is actually charged with how do we make sure that we continue to lead in this space, and how do we make sure that we're competitive on a global landscape. I think that's one of those pieces in the EO that's really important that hasn't been discussed a lot. Oftentimes it gets left behind when we think about the regulatory landscape, and maybe they go hand in hand. They almost certainly go hand in hand. But staying competitive, the United States is known for being the birthplace of really innovative technology. We are already the birthplace of blockchain and of crypto, and yet we don't have to be born and raised here, right? We can move elsewhere to actually go and spread our wings. So, sorry, I just talked to my 102-year-old grandmother. I'm thinking a lot about growing wings and things. So, sorry.
Now, let me take a slightly, I'll just say, different or nuanced perspective on that, which is some people say and go, we're falling behind as a plea for deregulation of our traditional approach. I don't think that's going to work, okay? Now, where would we be falling behind and where do we have to focus as regulators? Are we entrenching what I would say is legacy technology rather than embracing new technology that can do the regulatory job at least as well? So when people come to me and say, how should I approach regulators about this falling behind issue? I say, if you're going in and saying, look, this technology is so powerful, it's so efficient, it does so many things that you should loosen your regulation to accommodate it, that's a losing argument, okay? If you go in and say, look, this technology is so powerful, provides so many different degrees of flexibility and information that we can do the regulatory job at least as well. And in fact, better, that's something that regulators will embrace. And that's why I was very happy to see the focus in the executive order, and I think Eric Peters is going to speak later. We've talked about this a lot. On stablecoin, that is a very safe space for regulation and for regulation to accommodate new technology. It's demonstrably effective. We see tons of stablecoin transactions in number and in amount taking place every day, globally, 24/7, without significant frictions, particularly for a new innovation. This is something where regulators can embrace that across our payment system and say, look, this technology looks pretty good and can do the old job at least as well. So, as you incrementally adopt technology in a regulatory environment, you generally go to the safest space, and that's a pretty safe space.
Well, and do you think there are any ways that these efforts that are happening abroad, should they be informing what happens on the U.S. side, or should we be taking lessons from them, or should we be doing completely our own thing?
No, I think, look, as a regulator who regulates within your jurisdictional authority, but in a global market, you have to be cognizant of what goes on around the globe. Absolutely. I mean, right?
Yeah, we've thought a lot about the global best practices, and I think we've adopted some ideas because, again, we're a global company. We have to operate in many, many jurisdictions, and we have to comply with all of the different rules and regulations in all of those different jurisdictions. So it's really important that we get some harmonization and that we understand, again, that there's a consistent and level playing field, not just for Coinbase in different jurisdictions, but for all the different companies that are operating. So they're all adhering to the same high standards that the United States is known for. And so we really think that there are global best practices that we can adopt worldwide. In the United States, though, we're different than a lot of other countries, right? We have a fractured, or maybe I don't want to say fractured because that sounds like it's inefficient or ineffective. It's actually just a bifurcated system for regulation. And we also have states that are involved. We have 42 money transmission licenses. We have a BIT license. We have a trust charter. We have all of these we have regulators at the federal level. So it's not just about harmonizing globally, but it's also about creating consistency in the United States and determining how best to achieve that new regulation. I do think the crypto community is different than a lot of other industries, right? We actually are going to regulators, and I've been working with Coinbase since 2016. Since 2012, we started talking about how we wanted regulation. You don't hear that from industry very often. Actually going to regulators and saying, please give us a framework that will actually unlock innovation. It's very, very unique.
Well, and how do you think the U.S. is doing so far at this point with all of these competing priorities? We have consumer protection, we have privacy, innovation, leadership, even the administration has talked about some of these in their executive order. I mean, how would you rank the U.S. at this point from a regulatory perspective?
That's like giving yourself a grade, right?
Yeah, it's like giving yourself a grade.
You know, that's look. You have to look at it this way. I think the U.S. and I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The U.S. has the most investor and consumer-oriented financial regulation on the planet by a wide margin. And it doesn't matter whether the product is securities, whether the product is loans, the product is some other consumer-related thing. That's where we are. It has developed over time, as Kara mentioned. It's developed largely in response to failures, where we felt like we failed investors, felt like we failed consumers. In that environment, where you have, like I said, an innovation that is global, not domestic, and is retail, not institutional, I think people are doing pretty well trying to get their head around it. I don't think it was recognized that that was a new type of innovation, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But I also think that Kara said the industry, and I think there's a tremendous number of responsible players in the industry. There were irresponsible players in the industry. I mean, the ICO or ICO or whatever you want to call it, that was garbage. That was absolute garbage. And, you know, regulators have to respond to the garbage first. That's the job.
Ditto.
All right. Well, some things are garbage. That's I guess the takeaway from that.
Raise your hand if you made super normal returns in an ICO. Not selling it, buying it.
Well, you know, and I do want to get to, from an industry perspective, from someone who's been on a former regulator, you know, what are your predictions of what's possible in the next couple months? We have the reports from the executive order. We have some of these legislative bills that have been introduced. You know, what are your predictions?
Well, I'll tell you what I'd love to see. I would love to see clarity around stablecoin. What stablecoins are not securities, what stablecoins, you know, are effectively functioning within a permissive regulatory net across U.S. financial regulators. I'd like to see clarity around custody, because I think as we get clarity around custody, you can get clarity around things like resolution and what rights people have in the event things go wrong. Beyond that, you know, I don't look too far out into the future, but I think those are places where progress can be made for the industry and for regulators.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of opportunities within the next 6 months, and I completely agree. I think stablecoins is actually an area where there is agreement is coming together, and I think that really interesting thing about crypto, but stablecoins in particular, is the bipartisan nature of stablecoins. It's something that I think Republicans and Democrats could understand the value and the benefit of having a payment system that is really efficient, is immutable, is good for consumers, and so I think we could see both a legislative approach and potentially even further administrative action on this in terms of regulatory efforts. So I think that is one area where I'm very optimistic that we'll see some sort of activity. I think more largely the legislative proposals that are out there, I think it's really laying the foundation for what may happen in the future. These are really complicated issues. And as you see from the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, they have a lot of different pieces in there because this is complex. It touches lots of different parts of the government, whether it's tax, whether it's, you know, the CFTC or the SEC or all the rest of the different prudential regulators. There are a lot of different issues here. And so how you piece all those together in the legislative process takes a lot of time and a lot of expertise. And so that's what's being built, and those are the foundations that are being laid now. I am very optimistic that we will see legislation moving forward and actually getting across the finish line in the next year or so. And really applaud actually not only Senators Gillibrand, but a lot of the other members who are putting in the really hard work to come and talk to industry, to talk to consumer groups, to talk to other stakeholders about how crypto is impacting not only their voters and their communities, but how it's impacting the economy at large.
I guess we'll see. It's you might be more optimistic about Congress than a lot of people I know.
That's what happens. Eternal optimist here.
Well, but you want the steps that unleash the power of the private markets. And our payment system is at the core of all financial transactions. There's always a payment leg, or at least usually. And if you start to get that right, then the opportunities for digitizing, tokenizing other instruments, whether traditional instruments or new, are significant.
You raised a really good point that I would just also mention, that I think when we start to talk about things like tokenized securities and other new products, one of the things I think that's really important, and I know I've said this and I sound like a broken record, but having a transparent rulemaking process, we are very hopeful, I think, that regulators engage in that kind of transparent cooperation and communication with different folks in this landscape, because that actually, again, will also lay the foundation. These types of rules can't be done in a black box. It's really important that they engage everybody else.
Well, and with our last couple minutes here, I do want to ask, we had a poll that was on the screen a second ago, and we had asked some folks on Twitter what they thought the biggest regulatory issue facing the crypto industry was in the near term, and overwhelmingly it was SEC enforcement. I wanted to get your thoughts on what we've been seeing from the SEC, what we've been hearing from Chair Gensler. Do you agree that this is?
I feel like this should be your question to start with first. I will be happy to follow this up.
Look, there has been a lot of activity in the securities markets where the securities laws have not been followed. And the extent to which the SEC is going to enforce its laws is obviously a part of this. I do think that will pass. That phase will pass. People will understand that the definition of the security in the United States is extremely broad. If you're raising money for a venture, you should assume it's a security. That's why we have public and private markets. We have a different approach from most places. It's extremely broad. If you don't want to comply with the public offering rules, there's the private markets that you can access. They're robust. I do think that the most important thing will be legislation that unleashes the technology, or clarity from regulators, or realistically a combination of both, that unleashes the technology across the spectrum of products. That will become that issue will come to the fore, in my view.
Yeah, and I just think that if we have enforcement actions, I think it's really important that we, hand in hand with enforcement, that we don't regulate by enforcement. That we actually, if they're going to have enforcement actions that are justified, we also need to understand what the rules are and how we can maybe use new way of thinking in some of these different spaces. And again, enforcement is going to have to go hand in hand with regulatory clarity, transparency in rulemaking, and really a cooperation and an open dialogue. And we've had that open dialogue with a number of regulators, but continuing to have an open dialogue in order to get to an endpoint that makes sense.